Welcome back to Management 2020. The goal of this video is to talk more about revision as part of the writing or presentation process. So we'll talk about good writing processes and what stages revision should be part of that process. We'll also talk about a peer review study and the implication it has for us as peer reviewers. And then we'll distinguish between what's called local and global focus in the revision process. And finally, talk about the mindset and the tone of feedback when it comes to reviewing. So we've previously talked about effective writing processes. And although these processes can be cyclical and can kind of wind back on each other, in general, we've focused mostly on talking about the first three stages. So in this video, we want to talk more about the later stages because that's where this idea of reviewing and editing, revising comes in. And I want to take a moment here to share a research study from a friend of mine from graduate school, Christy Lundstrom. She now works as a lawyer, but she went through a linguistics program like I did, and her professor, Wendy Baker, was her guide as she conducted her research study. And essentially, Christy's focus was to determine whether peer review is helpful. And so peer review is the idea that we share our writing with the peer, in this case, probably a classmate, and our classmate reads our paper, gives us some feedback, and we can do the same for our classmate. Now, peer review isn't just something that can happen in school. As a researcher myself, I regularly meet with a team of other researchers from other universities, and we share our writing with each other. And we give feedback on our research process and our questions, and sometimes more on more language-related issues. So peer review can be a normal part of professional writing processes. In this particular study, Christy wanted to look at students across a wide section of writing classes. And she divided students in all of these writing classes into two groups. And usually within the same class, students would just be randomly assigned to one of the two groups so that teacher and time of day, none of that was a major factor in the study. And half of the students in these classes gave peer review during a scheduled time each week for classwork. The other group of students, sometimes in the same class, during the same time, they would receive peer review. So half of them would get a sample paper that a student had written, and they would just give feedback on that paper. They would write notes on the paper. The other group of students would get their own writing back, but it would have peer review comments. And so then they could read those comments and use them to integrate it into their writing and revising. All of the students, regardless of whatever treatment group they were in, took a pre-course writing assessment and an end-of-course writing assessment where they wrote essentially 30-minute essays, and then they were graded. Those essays were rated based on content organization, but also things like grammar, vocabulary, punctuation. So the results, which group improved the most? Well, thankfully, both groups improved. Now, part of this could just be because the course, the experience of being in a course helps students become better writers. But what the researchers found was that when they looked at the students who had been in the two treatment groups, the group that gave feedback and the group that received feedback, the group that gave feedback, even though it wasn't on their own writing, they made statistically significant more improvements than the group that received feedback. In other words, this suggests that just the action of reading a peer's paper and thinking about their paper and giving them advice helps you improve as a writer more than someone giving you advice. And in some ways, this has implications for the validity of peer review. Sometimes people feel like, well, I don't want anyone to review my paper except the teacher, because only the teacher knows what's right. And maybe the feedback you get from a peer maybe isn't that helpful sometimes, but the action of reading a peer's paper and thinking about the qualities of good writing and how it relates to your peer paper seems to make writers better. They become more critical about what is good writing, and then they're able to integrate those concepts into their own writing, even if no one gives them feedback on how to improve their own writing. Now, another finding of the study was that students in both groups saw more improvement in global feedback than in local feedback. So it means that and we'll talk more about this, but we've used similar, different terms for the same things. Global feedback is more this content and organization. Local feedback is things more like grammar and vocabulary. So this suggests that peer review can be effective, but especially it's effective more for the process of reading over papers and analyzing them and giving feedback. So let's talk more clearly about the difference between local and global feedback. So global aspects of writing, and we sometimes have used the term macro linguistic, is things like content, organization, task fulfillment. Is this doing what it's supposed to do? And local or micro feedback is things like style, readability, the presentation, and the formatting. Both of these things are important, but when we're in the process of giving feedback, it's more effective to provide global feedback first and then focus on local feedback. So when we're in the process of doing global revision for ourselves or giving that kind of feedback for others, we should be asking questions about purpose, content, and organization. So does the document meet the communication purpose? Is there necessary information that's included here? Does it have the right information that the audience needs? And then is the document organized well so that the reader can find and follow the information? Now, local feedback instead is focusing on things like formatting and spelling and grammar. And so what you might ask questions like, does the document follow visual expectations? Does it look like a professional document of this type? Then facts as well. If there's factual information included in here, is it verified? Is it supported appropriately? You might have to be a fact checker. That was one of my jobs when I used to work as a writer for a company, was to fact check the information in our documents because it was shared with school children. So the articles we'd write, we need to make sure that information could be verified by multiple sources, that the original author hadn't just relied on a single source that might have misinformation. And then we need to remember not to always rely solely on grammar and spell checking software. It can miss things, it can miss names, it can miss spelling. If it's a different word, it's spelled correctly. It doesn't always catch grammar and punctuation things either. So we can use these tools, but we can't rely on them completely. So part of this local feedback is also making revisions for style or professionalism. And this is looking at things like our sentence length, our vocabulary, our use of parallel construction, and also the objective way that we describe things. So sentence length, one of the things we want to look at is, are we using concise phrasing? And do we have a variety of sentence types? Not everything is a simple sentence, or not everything is a complex compound sentence. That variety can keep readers engaged, and we're using variety as appropriate for the things that we're explaining. Some things, a simple sentence is better. Other things, we need to have complex or compound sentences to show relationships. As we write sentences, though, we want to avoid using filler language, using empty phrases, using maybe like a lot. That can be considered a filler. And when we're giving an oral presentation, trying to avoid the use of oral filler like and those languages make our writing or our text longer, and they're less professional, less concise, less to the point. Now, repetition sometimes is helpful in whether it's a written document or a presentation, but we want to avoid unnecessary repetition. So sometimes we need to tell the readers what we're going to tell them, and then repeat to them what we told them to reinforce an idea. But we want to be careful that there is that we eliminate unnecessary repetition so the document stays concise. Now, when it comes to vocabulary, we want to aim for an appropriate reading level for our audience. Traditionally, many newspapers are written at kind of a middle school, kind of maybe eighth grade writing level. And that's trying to make sure that documents are accessible to a wide variety of the public. Now, when we're writing maybe for more specialized fields, we might be able to assume that the audience has more education. We could write it at a high school level. If you're reading academic research articles, you've probably experienced that those are written very much at a university graduate level. The complexity in grammar and vocabulary and concepts are not very accessible for an everyday audience. So we need to know who our audience is, and we need to make sure that we're using vocabulary and grammar that is accessible for that audience. So we want to make sure we're avoiding things like jargon, slang, or archaic, old-fashioned phrases that make our writing less accessible. We also want to pay attention to parallel construction. So parallel construction is using similar grammatical structures in things like lists or across paragraphs. So here's an example of a list that does not have parallel construction. And you can see that the items in the list are expanding into a European market to develop new mobile application, cost reduction across all departments, and we will hire 5 new sales associates. Every single item in this list uses a different grammatical construction. One of them uses the gerund or the ing. One of them uses the verb infinitive, the to plus verb. One of them uses a noun phrase, cost reduction. And the last one is a clause. It's a complete sentence with a subject and a predicate. When we don't use good parallel construction, the readers have to work harder to compare and understand information. And so we want to avoid these kinds of problems, and parallel construction can make the writing more accessible and easier for the audience to understand and compare. So here's a revision. In this case, we've just moved all of the items in this objectives list to the gerund format, the ing format, expanding into, developing, reducing, and hiring. It makes it easier and more pleasant for the audience. It's less of a cognitive load for the reader. In addition to parallel construction, we also want to make sure that the descriptions in our writing, especially in business writing, avoid biased, opinionated, and overly emotional language. We want to make sure that we come across as fair and consistent in the way that we treat topics. And so we don't want to share a lot of personal opinion, but we do want to. It doesn't mean that we can't make arguments in our writing, but we need to present information in an objective way so that we are treating the topic and we're treating our audience fairly. Additionally, another part of local feedback is document formatting. So this is using consistency and structure such as headings and paragraphs, making them look similar so audience can understand how information is organized. Making sure that we're using appropriate use of margins, white space, indenting, and that it's used consistently throughout the document. Taking a look at our font or typeface, making sure that we're using one font type, one font size, unless we're using a different font type and size for things like headings. Sometimes when students copy a quote or other material from one source and they paste it into their document, that formatting of the source document may get copied into their document, and now they've got this inconsistent font or size or typeface. And so one thing to be careful is if you are going to copy something into your document, doing a Control-Shift paste, which eliminates the source document formatting, or when you right click or you go into the edit menu to paste it in, you choose to just paste the text and not to paste its formatting. Additionally, as we look through formatting, we want to look at our visuals. And have we labeled visuals, things like paragraphs and tables correctly? Have we made reference to those paragraphs and tables in our paragraphs, in our descriptions, so that someone doesn't see a picture and wonder why this picture is here, what the picture represents, and how it connects to the rest of the document? And lastly, if we're using shared documents and we're inviting people to look at attachments, have we made sure that all of our links work? Or have we made sure that any shared documents have open permissions so that the people who access the documents can open them and view them? So let's sort of do a review about the mindset of someone who is reviewing the work of others. I work as an editor of a professional journal, and I did some training. I found an online um, uh, series of videos to help reviewers of academic papers do their job better. And some of the things that I learned is the importance of thinking about the person who wrote the text. And what is our goal for that person? And what is our goal for the text? It's not about us. When we're a reviewer, we should not make it about lifting our ego or making someone else feel bad for their work. Our goal should be to help the writer and to help the text become the best that they can be. So some of the ways we can do that is to focus on global feedback first. And then if there's time and if there's an invitation to do so, then focus on local feedback. It's not very helpful to jump in and start editing someone's document by changing their punctuation or their vocabulary or telling them that their grammar is bad. It doesn't build a good relationship with the writer. And that's not really where your focus should be, because before we can address those issues, we need to make sure we have the right content. So as you give feedback, focus more on I statements, your experience, rather than you statements telling the writer what to do. So essentially, you're describing your experience as a writer. As you read through this document, what makes sense to you, and highlight those good things. If there's a really good or helpful sentence or introduction or summary or conclusion, highlight that for the reader. Say, I really appreciate it. This helped me understand this, or this framed this paragraph really well. If there are things you're confused about, then write it. Said, I had some difficulty understanding this sentence and how it relates to the previous one, or I'm not sure what the purpose of this paragraph is. Could you clarify? And so that idea of asking questions rather than judging or commanding, telling people fix this or this is not good, that is not as well received, and it's harder for the reader to maintain an emotional openness to feedback if they feel like they're being criticized or attacked. So essentially, again, the questions we want to ask is, how can I help this text communicate its message effectively? And how can I help the person who wrote this text become a better communicator by the types of questions I ask and by the type of feedback I give? And lastly, if we think back to Christy and Wendy's study, how can I learn about the process of being a good writer by giving this feedback? How will it help me develop and be a better writer as well? Because we may be learning from both the good things that the writer does in the work we review, and also maybe learning from some of the things that they don't do well that we can avoid in our own writing. So in this video, we talked about the revision part of the writing process, about a peer review study that revealed the value of giving feedback. And we made the distinction between local and global feedback, and how, as a reviewer, we need to have the right kind of mindset and tone when we give feedback so that our reviewers can effectively learn from that feedback, but also how we can learn from that feedback process as well.